All right, everyone, buckle up because we're diving headfirst into a topic that's near and dear to all of our hearts. Or should I say stomachs? Sausages.
Oh yeah, who doesn't love a good sausage? But as much as we enjoy them, there's a lot more to these savory treats than meets the eye.
That's right. We're digging into the research you sent over, especially this paper called The Effect on Health of the Presence of Sodium and Cholesterol in Sausages. And let me tell you, it's got some pretty eye-opening stuff about those delicious links and patties we love so much.
It really does. It's fascinating, you know? We often grill up our favorite sausages without giving a second thought to what might be hidden inside those casings.
It's true. A plate of sausage and peppers is a staple in our house. But this research throws some pretty wild stats at us, especially when it comes to sodium levels.
You're telling me. The paper talks about this study where they analyzed 5 different sausage brands. And get this, every single one of them went over the World Health Organization's recommended daily sodium intake.
Whoa, seriously? Every single one?
Yeah, everyone. Some of them were way over, too.
Okay, so for those of us who haven't memorized the WHO guidelines, how much sodium are we actually supposed to be having each day?
So the WHO suggests a limit of 2,000 milligrams of sodium per day for us adults. But what's crazy is that just a single serving of some of these sausages, we're talking like half of that already?
Wait, so 2 sausages and you've basically hit your sodium limit for the day?
Pretty much.
Wow. And that's before we even think about all the other stuff we eat throughout the day, right? I mean, it's not like we only have 2 sausages and call it a day.
Exactly. It all adds up. And consistently going over that recommended sodium intake is where things get kind of risky. The research links it to a higher chance of developing cardiovascular disease.
And that's a pretty big deal.
Huge deal.
Okay, so high sodium, bad for the heart. I think we all get that. But how exactly does that work? Like, what's happening in our bodies when we overload them with sodium?
Well, one of the main things sodium does is mess with your blood pressure. Think of it like this: too much sodium in your blood. It's like a sponge that just keeps soaking up more and more water. That means your blood volume goes up, which puts more pressure on those artery walls.
So kind of like trying to force way too much water through a tiny hose. Eventually, something has to give.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it. And over time, that constant pressure, that can turn into hypertension. And that's when the risk of heart attacks, strokes, all those serious problems goes way up.
Okay, so that's one strike against sodium. What about the other bad boy lurking in our beloved sausage? Cholesterol. The research talks about that too, right?
It sure does. They actually pull in findings from the USDA that show something like 71 milligrams of cholesterol in an average serving of sausage.
Okay.
And while that number might not mean much on its own, it's important to understand the role of something called LDL cholesterol.
Right. LDL cholesterol, or as we like to call it, the bad cholesterol. Can you remind us why it has such a terrible reputation?
Well, in a nutshell, having high levels of LDL cholesterol means that it can build up in your arteries, kind of like how plaque builds up in your pipes.
Okay, I'm getting some interesting visuals now, but I get what you're saying.
The thing is, all that buildup makes it harder for blood to flow through. It's like trying to squeeze the same amount of something through a much smaller space. And that forces your heart to work a lot harder just to do its job.
So high sodium, stiffening our blood vessels, cholesterol clogging things up. Sounds like a recipe for disaster. But before we get too bummed out, let's dig a little deeper into how these things actually affect our bodies long term. What else does the research have to say?
Yeah, let's dive into some of the specifics. For example, did you know that sodium does way more than just directly impact your blood pressure? It can even affect the elasticity of your blood vessels.
Okay, blood vessel elasticity. Sounds important, but in English, please. What does that even mean? Okay, blood vessel elasticity. Sounds important, but in English, please. What does that even mean?
You know those bendy straws everyone had as a kid? Imagine your blood vessels are kind of like that. Healthy blood vessels are flexible, right? They expand and contract with each heartbeat, all nice and smooth so your blood can flow easily.
Got it. So what's sodium doing to our bendy straws?
Well, if you have too much sodium, it's like those straws get all stiff and rigid over time. They can't bend as easily.
Oh.
Yeah, and when your blood vessels lose their elasticity like that, it's like trying to pump the same amount of liquid through a narrower, less flexible tube, way more pressure, and your heart has to work a lot harder than it should.
Ooh, I'm picturing like squeezing a water balloon in the middle. All that pressure has to go somewhere, right?
Exactly.
And if the balloon can't expand, boom, not what we want happening with our arteries.
Definitely not. And this is where the research gets even more interesting. It talks about how sodium actually messes with this molecule called nitric oxide. And this nitric oxide, it's basically like the relaxation crew for your blood vessels.
Wait, we have a molecule that's just dedicated to keeping our blood vessels chilled out. That's so cool.
Right, but here's the thing. Too much sodium can actually stop the nitric oxide from doing its job properly.
Oh, no, really?
Yeah, so not only is the sodium making the blood vessels stiffer on its own, but it's also throwing a wrench in our body's own built-in system for relaxing those blood vessels.
Talk about a double whammy for your heart. We're really starting to see how this all connects, It's not just about individual sausages here and there. It's the long-term effects of those choices that we make every day.
100%. And speaking of long-term, let's get back to cholesterol for a minute. You were asking earlier about how exactly it builds up in our arteries.
Yeah, it kind of seemed like a good time to move on from the whole plaque in your plumbing analogy, even though it totally makes sense.
Well, the research actually uses a fancy term they call it aterosclerosis.
Aterosclerosis doesn't exactly roll off the tongue. Is that the scientific term for clogged pipes?
Pretty much. Basically, when you've got all that LDL cholesterol floating around in your bloodstream, it can start to stick to the walls of your arteries. And over time, that forms plaque.
So the more LDL cholesterol we have, the more likely it is to just stick to our artery walls like gunk in a drain.
You got it. And as that gunk builds up, that passageway in your arteries gets narrower and narrower. Your heart has to work even harder to push your blood through, just like with those stiff blood vessels we talked about earlier.
It's like adding insult to injury. Sodium's over here making our blood vessels all stiff and rigid, and then cholesterol swoops in and sets up roadblocks inside them.
And it's not just heart health that we have to worry about. The research actually draws a connection between these high sodium processed meats like sausages and a bigger risk of developing type 2 diabetes too.
Wait, seriously, type 2 diabetes too? Now this is getting intense. I know there's a link between your diet and diabetes, but I didn't realize sausages were in on that too.
It's there. This research highlights how eating a lot of processed meats, which tend to be loaded with sodium and all those unhealthy saturated fats, can really mess with your insulin resistance. And that's a major factor when it comes to developing type 2 diabetes.
Okay, so let me get this straight. We've got the sodium messing with our blood pressure, the cholesterol creating those artery clogging traffic jams, and now we're throwing an increased risk of diabetes into the mix.
It's a bit of a domino effect.
It really is. And remember that whole unfavorable lipid profile thing we talked about earlier?
Right.
The research found that people who eat a lot of sausages often have way more of those unhealthy fats in their blood. So that just adds fuel to the fire, increasing the chances of developing all these health problems. This is really adding up. It's not just about saying no to the occasional sausage. This is about understanding that even those little choices we make about what we eat, especially the ones we don't think twice about, can snowball into some major health impacts down the road.
Exactly. And while it might seem like this research is painting a pretty bleak picture, it's also really empowering,
How so?